Billionaire came home early and saw what his wife did to his old mother. The door shut softly behind him, but what Nathaniel Cross saw inside made his entire body go numb. Time seemed to stutter, then slow, then almost stop. His mother, Eleanor Cross, sat in her wheelchair in the middle of the marble foyer, her posture stiff, her shoulders drawn inward as if she were trying to disappear. Standing directly in front of her was Vivian, Nathaniel's wife, elegant as always in a fitted black dress. But elegance vanished the moment Nathaniel's eyes dropped lower. Vivian's stiletto heel was planted squarely on Eleanor's frail foot. Not accidentally, not lightly. Pressed down with deliberate force. Eleanor's lips quivered, her breath shallow, her fingers clawing at the armrests as she fought not to cry out. "I warned you," Vivian said coldly, her voice low and sharp, slicing through the cavernous silence. "You don't touch my things." Nathaniel's heart slammed so hard against his ribs it hurt. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. This had to be some horrible misunderstanding, some split-second illusion caused by exhaustion from travel. But then Eleanor made a small, broken sound, half gasp, half sob, and Vivian shifted her weight. Eleanor flinched. The pain was real, and so was the cruelty. Nathaniel felt a rush of heat flood his veins, followed by a chilling clarity that terrified him more than rage ever could. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was control. This was punishment. Nathaniel took a step forward, the echo of his shoe against the marble floor sounding thunderous in his ears. Vivian still hadn't noticed him. She leaned down closer to Eleanor, her perfectly manicured hand gripping the wheelchair handle like a threat. "You really should learn," Vivian whispered, venom wrapped in silk, "that this is my house now." Eleanor's eyes were glossy, rimmed red with unshed tears, but she held her chin up, clinging to the last fragments of dignity she had left. That quiet resistance seemed to irritate Vivian even more. She pressed her heel down harder. Eleanor winced, her body trembling. Nathaniel's fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Every instinct screamed at him to rush forward, to tear Vivian away, to shout until the walls shook. But something rooted him to the spot: shock, horror, and a sickening realization that if this was happening now out in the open, then something far worse had been happening when he wasn't home. His billionaire empire had taught him to read rooms, to spot danger, to see patterns others missed. And suddenly, memories he had ignored came crashing back with brutal force. Eleanor's quiet silences at dinner, the way she avoided Vivian's eyes, the unexplained bruises she dismissed as clumsiness, the time she insisted she was fine even when her voice shook. Nathaniel had been too busy, too confident, too sure that the woman he loved could never be capable of something like this. He had defended Vivian to friends, to staff, even to his own mother. "She's just strict," he had said once. "She likes things done her way." Eleanor had smiled faintly and said nothing more. Now Nathaniel understood why. The Cross estate suddenly felt like a prison. The high ceilings, the white walls, the grand staircase sweeping upward, it all loomed over Eleanor like a silent audience to her suffering. This house had been built with love, with gratitude. Nathaniel had sworn his mother would never know hardship again. She had raised him alone after his father's sudden death, scrubbing floors at night, skipping meals so he could attend private school on scholarship. She had believed in him when no one else did. And now she sat here, reduced to an obstacle, an inconvenience, a target. Vivian straightened slightly, adjusting her posture as if she were posing for a photograph. "Honestly," she said, rolling her eyes, "you act like a victim when all you do is cause problems." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I only wanted to look at the photo." Vivian's lips curled into a thin smile. "My photo," she snapped. "My frame, my memories." She leaned closer again. You don't belong in them." That was when Eleanor's gaze shifted past Vivian, her eyes suddenly widening, not with relief but with fear. She shook her head ever so slightly, a silent warning. "Don't." Nathaniel's chest tightened painfully. Even now, even in pain, his mother was trying to protect him. Protect him from the truth. Protect him from the woman he had married. Vivian followed Eleanor's gaze slowly, her expression changing in stages: annoyance, curiosity, then calculation. She lifted her heel off Eleanor's foot and stepped back, smoothing her dress as if nothing had happened. Nathaniel stood there, his face unreadable, his eyes dark. Vivian smiled at him, warm and polished, the same smile she wore at charity galas and board dinners. "You're home early," she said lightly. "Your meeting in Zurich ended ahead of schedule?" The lie was effortless. Nathaniel glanced down at his mother's foot. A red mark was already swelling beneath her thin stocking. Eleanor noticed his gaze and quickly pulled her foot back as if ashamed of the evidence. That small movement hit Nathaniel harder than any blow. Shame, fear, silence. Those were the tools Vivian used. "Yes," Nathaniel said finally, his voice calm, almost detached. "I came home early." Vivian laughed softly. "Perfect timing," she said. "I was just reminding Eleanor about the house rules." Eleanor looked down at her lap, her hands shaking despite her effort to steady them. Nathaniel felt something inside him harden. He realized then that confronting Vivian, now exploding in anger, would only scratch the surface. Whatever game she was playing, she was confident, untouchable. She believed he would never truly see her, and that belief was her greatest mistake. Nathaniel helped his mother gently, kneeling beside her wheelchair. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded, though tears slipped down her cheeks. "I'm fine," she whispered, the same lie she had been telling for months. Nathaniel stood, his height suddenly imposing, his presence filling the room. Vivian watched him closely now, her smile tight, her eyes sharp. For the first time since he walked in, she looked unsure. As Nathaniel escorted his mother away, every step echoed with a single terrifying truth. This was not a one-time act of cruelty. It was a pattern. And patterns, once exposed, had consequences. Nathaniel Cross had built his fortune by destroying lies with facts and power with strategy. What Vivian didn't know, what she could never imagine, was that the moment he walked through that door, her reign inside the Cross family had already begun to crumble. Nathaniel couldn't stop thinking about the moment he had walked into that foyer. Every detail was burned into his mind. The polished marble, the echo of his footsteps, his mother's trembling hands, and Vivian's heel pressing down with the precision of a predator. But more than the visual memory, it was the realization that everything he thought he knew about his wife had been a lie. For months, he had dismissed the subtle signs, her disdainful glances, the way she insisted on controlling every aspect of his mother's life. But now, seeing it in front of his eyes, he knew he had been blind. And the worst part? He had allowed this to happen in his own home, under his own roof. By the time Nathaniel settled Eleanor into her private study, a quiet room she had always loved because of its sunlight and the view of the gardens, the anger had transformed into a cold, calculating focus. Eleanor remained silent, her eyes downcast, but Nathaniel could feel the tension radiating from her. He didn't speak immediately, sensing that words could only worsen her pain right now. Instead, he knelt beside her, gently brushing a lock of her silver hair from her face. "Mom," he whispered, his voice low but steady, "we're going to fix this. I promise." Eleanor's lips quivered, and for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to lean into her son's strength, trusting that someone would finally stand up for her. Meanwhile, Vivian, unaware that Nathaniel had fully grasped the magnitude of her actions, returned to her meticulous routines, moving through the house like nothing had occurred. In public, she was a model of grace and philanthropy, donating millions to charities and hosting elegant dinners for the city's elite. Behind closed doors, however, she was a master manipulator, a woman who had spent years learning to dominate, control, and humiliate those she deemed weaker than herself. Nathaniel realized with a pang of horror that this was just the surface. The veneer of wealth and elegance hid a ruthlessness that could destroy anyone who challenged her authority. That evening, Nathaniel invited Vivian to dinner, ostensibly as a gesture of normalcy. The table was set precisely as she preferred: crystal glasses, silver cutlery, flowers arranged in geometric perfection. Vivian arrived, radiant as ever, smiling at Nathaniel as though the tension of the day had never existed. But Nathaniel had learned a vital lesson: never let outward appearances fool you. He watched her carefully, noting every micro-expression, every flicker of annoyance or triumph. He could see the calculated effort in her smile, the subtle tightening of her jaw whenever Eleanor entered the room. "You're early," Vivian said, voice lilting, as if teasing him. "The Zurich meeting must have ended faster than you anticipated," Nathaniel nodded, sitting down opposite her, maintaining his composure. "Yes," he replied calmly, "but I thought it was important to come home. Spend time with family." He let the words hang in the air, watching her closely. Vivian's eyes flicked toward Eleanor, who remained at the far end of the table, and Nathaniel noticed a faint glimmer of irritation pass across her face. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Nathaniel had learned to read every motion, every hesitation. As dinner progressed, Vivian tried to dominate the conversation, steering it toward topics she could control: fashion, high-profile events, acquisitions, charitable initiatives. Eleanor, however, remained unusually silent, her gaze fixed on the table. Nathaniel sensed her discomfort and knew that any attempt to speak could trigger Vivian's wrath. Instead, he subtly redirected the discussion, asking questions about Eleanor's garden, about books she had recently read, about memories from Nathaniel's childhood. Eleanor's eyes softened, a fragile smile forming on her lips. Nathaniel felt a surge of hope. He was reaching her, reminding her that she still had a voice, still had influence. But Vivian noticed the shift immediately. Her smile faltered, her grip on the wine glass tightening slightly, her knuckles whitening. "Mom, you've always been sentimental," she said smoothly, though the sharpness in her tone betrayed her irritation. "Focusing on the past won't help anyone in this family." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. She was testing him now, probing his resolve, trying to see if he would falter. But he didn't. He leaned back, deliberately ignoring her barb, maintaining his calm demeanor. After dinner, Nathaniel guided Eleanor to her room, making sure she felt safe before retreating to his study. The mansion was quiet now, but the tension was palpable. Every corner seemed to hold Vivian's presence, her influence saturating the walls. Nathaniel began reviewing the household logs, looking for patterns, any indication of the manipulations and control she had exerted over the staff, over his mother, over the very life he had built. What he found was staggering. Vivian had meticulously documented every instance where she could assert dominance, every moment she could isolate Eleanor, every subtle humiliation designed to remind the older woman that she was powerless. It was a campaign of psychological warfare, and Nathaniel realized he had been oblivious until now. The next morning, Nathaniel called in his most trusted advisors, people who had been with him since the earliest days of his empire. He briefed them on the situation, careful not to reveal too much of the personal trauma, but emphasizing the strategic implications. Vivian, he explained, was not just manipulative in private. She had begun encroaching on business decisions, steering investments, undermining key relationships. If left unchecked, her influence could destabilize the family fortune, the company, and the very legacy he had inherited from his parents. His advisors nodded gravely, sensing the urgency. Nathaniel outlined a plan: gather evidence, protect his mother, and gradually expose Vivian's true nature to the right people. Meanwhile, Vivian, ever perceptive, sensed a change. Nathaniel's demeanor had shifted subtly but unmistakably. He was no longer the oblivious husband, distracted by work and appearances. He was alert, aware, calculating. And the moment she realized this, a flicker of unease crossed her otherwise impenetrable facade. She spent hours reviewing the household herself, checking on staff, monitoring security cameras, making subtle inquiries, but Nathaniel's preparations were thorough. Every action he took was deliberate, every move designed to protect Eleanor and regain control. Days passed in a tense standoff. Vivian maintained her public charm, attending charity galas, hosting high society luncheons, smiling for the cameras. But behind closed doors, the mansion had become a battlefield. Nathaniel and Eleanor worked together, small acts of defiance and subtle resistance building momentum. Eleanor, once quiet and subdued, began leaving small notes, making tiny requests that defied Vivian's attempts at domination. Nathaniel intercepted every attempt by Vivian to isolate his mother, countering her manipulations with careful strategy. One evening, the tension reached a breaking point. Nathaniel discovered Vivian attempting to remove a series of personal letters. Eleanor had kept for decades letters detailing family history, personal triumphs, secrets of Nathaniel's childhood that Vivian deemed irrelevant. The sheer audacity of the act sparked a fierce confrontation. "Those letters are not yours to destroy," Nathaniel said, his voice low and controlled but loaded with fury. Vivian's eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. "I decide what stays in this house," she said, her tone icy. "You're free to believe whatever stories you want, but history belongs to the present, not the past." That moment crystallized everything Nathaniel had realized in the foyer. Vivian's cruelty wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. It was methodical. And it had been hiding in plain sight, protected by charm, elegance, and wealth. Nathaniel knew the next step had to be decisive. He couldn't simply confront her emotionally. He had to dismantle her influence, piece by piece, while protecting his mother from further harm. The mansion, once a symbol of comfort and family legacy, had become the arena for a psychological war, and Nathaniel was finally ready to fight on Eleanor's behalf, prepared to expose every secret, every manipulation, every lie Vivian had woven into their lives. And deep down, Nathaniel felt a spark of grim satisfaction. For the first time, he realized the scale of the battle ahead, and he was ready. The billionaire who had been caught off guard, who had underestimated his wife's cruelty, was now fully awake. Every action, every word, every small rebellion would matter. And in the shadows of the Cross estate, Eleanor, once powerless and afraid, began to realize she wasn't alone. Together she and Nathaniel would turn the tide, and Vivian, for all her elegance and cunning, would soon discover that control has limits, and even the most carefully constructed power can crumble. The next week was a turning point for the Cross household. Nathaniel had transformed the mansion into a fortress of observation and subtle resistance, each room a stage in a carefully orchestrated plan. Cameras, previously installed for security, were now monitored meticulously, and the staff, all long-time, loyal employees, had been quietly briefed. Nathaniel didn't just want to protect his mother anymore. He wanted to understand Vivian, to trace every thread of her manipulation, to anticipate every move she could make. The game had shifted. He was no longer a victim of circumstance. He was a predator in his own right. Vivian, of course, remained elegantly unaware, or so she thought. She continued her routine with a precision that seemed flawless. Breakfast at precisely 8 a.m. The daily reading of financial reports, a carefully timed stroll through the gardens, phone calls with high-profile contacts, invitations to social events. Nathaniel noted everything, memorized patterns, and subtly altered them to test her reactions. Every deviation, every small sign of annoyance or surprise, was catalogued. He needed proof. He realized proof that would reveal her true nature to the outside world, where her power and charm masked the reality of her cruelty. The first major revelation came unexpectedly during what seemed like a routine afternoon. Eleanor, who had grown braver under Nathaniel's guidance, approached him quietly with a folder of documents she had kept hidden for decades. Letters, financial statements, and personal notes, all detailing instances where Vivian had manipulated investments, pressured employees, and even coerced minor staff members into acts of compliance. It was meticulous, damning evidence showing a calculated pattern of abuse and exploitation. Nathaniel's eyes widened as he leafed through the papers. This wasn't just cruelty toward Eleanor, it was systematic domination designed to consolidate power within the family and the company. Nathaniel realized the scale of Vivian's actions. She hadn't just been bullying his mother in secret. She had been embedding herself into the very infrastructure of their lives. She had isolated Eleanor from the staff, gained influence over business decisions, and subtly controlled Nathaniel's perception of reality. Every challenge she presented, every subtle humiliation, was a thread in a much larger tapestry, one that could have destroyed the family if left unchecked. But now, with evidence in hand, Nathaniel understood that he could turn the table. Vivian's first sign of suspicion appeared subtly. During one of her daily routines, she noticed a small rearrangement of files on her desk. Documents she had left meticulously aligned, now slightly misaligned. A minor detail, but enough to provoke a flicker of irritation. She glanced at Nathaniel, who was casually reviewing contracts nearby, and for the first time, their eyes met in an unspoken challenge. Nathaniel didn't flinch. He simply smiled faintly. Neutral, unreadable. Vivian's lips tightened imperceptibly. The realization had begun to dawn. Her husband was no longer oblivious. As the days passed, Nathaniel began implementing small, calculated countermeasures. Staff who had previously feared Vivian were quietly given subtle instructions, creating opportunities for evidence to surface naturally. Eleanor, growing more confident, began documenting instances of mistreatment, voices, photographs, even recordings of manipulative conversations. Each day, Vivian's facade of control began to crack, imperceptibly at first, then more clearly as Nathaniel executed his strategy with precision. The real turning point came one evening during a high-profile charity gala. Vivian had planned the event meticulously, ensuring that every detail reflected her personal brand: elegance, sophistication, social influence. Nathaniel accompanied her, outwardly supportive, yet inside, every interaction was calculated. He observed her behavior, noted the subtle manipulations she used on donors and staff, and quietly began executing the next stage of his plan. Eleanor, meanwhile, had secretly attended, her presence unnoticed, quietly documenting Vivian's actions from the periphery. During the gala, Vivian attempted to undermine a longtime family advisor, subtly questioning their competence in front of the board and donors. Nathaniel, however, intervened smoothly, framing his corrections as collaborative and highlighting the advisor's expertise. Vivian's irritation was barely concealed, her smile stiff, but the public perception began to shift subtly in Nathaniel's favor. Eleanor, observing from the shadows, whispered quietly to herself, a small smile playing on her lips. For the first time in months, she felt the power of truth aligning with action. Returning home that night, Nathaniel confronted Vivian privately, using a combination of calm authority and subtle intimidation. "Vivian," he began, his tone measured, "I know everything." Her eyes widened briefly, a flicker of panic betraying the carefully maintained mask of control. "Everything?" she asked, voice almost too casual, though the tension was palpable. Nathaniel nodded, laying out the evidence Eleanor had collected. The letters, the financial manipulations, the accounts of psychological coercion. Vivian's composure wavered, though she attempted to maintain a poised exterior. "You can't prove it," she said, though the tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. Nathaniel smiled faintly, not triumphantly, but with the satisfaction of someone who had been blind to danger and now saw it clearly. "I don't need to prove it to you," he replied. "The proof will speak for itself to the staff, to the company, to the board, and most importantly, to everyone who matters in this family." Vivian's eyes narrowed, her mind racing for a way to regain control, but Nathaniel had anticipated this. Every potential escape, every manipulation had already been accounted for. Over the following days, the consequences of Vivian's actions began to unravel in subtle but undeniable ways. Staff members who had previously feared her began coming forward, sharing experiences, corroborating Eleanor's records. Business associates began noticing discrepancies in her directives, small financial inconsistencies, and uncharacteristic decisions that undermined her credibility. The house itself, once a symbol of her absolute control, became a stage where her influence diminished with each passing interaction. Nathaniel orchestrated these events with meticulous precision, always protecting Eleanor from direct exposure while allowing Vivian's own patterns to lead to her downfall. Eleanor, meanwhile, experienced a profound transformation. Once submissive and fearful, she began asserting herself, her confidence bolstered by Nathaniel's unwavering support and the growing evidence against Vivian. Simple acts, a request ignored no longer, a conversation redirected, a decision defended, became statements of moral authority. Vivian's psychological grip on her weakened day by day, replaced by a newfound respect and acknowledgement of Eleanor's resilience. The crescendo arrived unexpectedly late one night. Nathaniel discovered Vivian attempting to access secure financial accounts, intending to reassert control over assets she had tried to manipulate for months. Eleanor, standing beside him for support, witnessed the scene unfold. Vivian, confronted directly, attempted deception and denial, but the evidence was irrefutable. Every action, every manipulation, every act of intimidation was documented, recorded, and verifiable. Vivian's calculated arrogance collapsed under the weight of truth. For the first time, Nathaniel saw the fear in Vivian's eyes, not the practiced, elegant kind, but raw, unshielded panic. The realization hit her. The empire she had tried to manipulate, the family she had sought to dominate, was no longer hers to control. Nathaniel, holding the balance of power firmly, felt a grim satisfaction. Justice, long delayed, was finally within reach. Eleanor, radiant with a mix of relief and quiet triumph, reached for Nathaniel's hand, her grip steady and strong. The mansion, which had once been a silent witness to cruelty, was now alive with the energy of confrontation and revelation. Every creaking floorboard, every polished surface reflected the truth that power without conscience is fleeting, that manipulation cannot withstand strategy and courage, and that even the most calculated control can crumble when challenged with patience, planning, and unwavering moral authority. As Vivian retreated into the shadows of her own making, Nathaniel and Eleanor stood side by side, resolute. They had weathered the storm, faced the consequences, and begun reclaiming the family legacy that had been threatened. The billionaire, once caught off guard, had awakened fully. And the path toward the final confrontation, the reckoning that would ensure justice and restore dignity, was now clear. Nathaniel had spent weeks meticulously preparing for this moment, but nothing could have fully captured the intensity of the confrontation that was about to unfold. Vivian had begun to sense the walls closing in, her confidence eroding with every witness, every piece of evidence, every small act of defiance from Eleanor. She had once believed herself untouchable, untied from consequence by charm, wealth, and strategic manipulation. But Nathaniel had learned her patterns, traced her every move, and turned her own cunning against her. The billionaire had returned not merely as a husband or a son, but as a force of justice, precise and unstoppable. The day began quietly, deceptively ordinary. Nathaniel had invited the household staff to a meeting in the Grand Hall under the pretext of announcing new schedules. Eleanor sat beside him, her presence calm but commanding, a quiet testament to the transformation she had undergone. Vivian arrived later, dressed impeccably as always, her eyes scanning the room with practiced elegance, expecting compliance. But as she stepped into the hall, Nathaniel's gaze met hers, sharp and unyielding. Every person present, longtime employees, advisors, and a few select board members, was fully aware of the truth. Nathaniel had briefed them meticulously, ensuring no detail would escape scrutiny. "Vivian," Nathaniel began, voice calm yet laced with authority, "thank you for joining us. We have matters to discuss that concern the entire household and the integrity of this family." Vivian's eyes flickered, a micro-expression of tension betraying the poise she tried to project. She forced a polite smile. "Of course," she said, though her tone carried a subtle tremor. Nathaniel continued, slowly, deliberately, laying out the evidence that Eleanor had helped compile over the past weeks. The letters, the recordings, the financial manipulations, and testimonies from staff members who had long suffered in silence. Each piece was presented clearly, with precision, leaving no room for denial. Vivian's composure began to crack. She attempted her usual defenses: charm, misdirection, and carefully crafted denials. "You're twisting the truth," she said, voice pitched higher than intended. "These are exaggerations, misunderstandings." Nathaniel allowed her to speak, letting her expend her energy, all the while reinforcing the narrative of evidence and witness statements. Eleanor, seated beside him, radiated quiet strength, occasionally glancing at Vivian with a calm yet unwavering gaze. It was Eleanor's moral authority, grown over weeks of careful strategy and courage, that made the confrontation truly irreversible. As Vivian grew more defensive, Nathaniel executed the next phase of his plan. He called attention to the surveillance footage, the subtle manipulations captured on video over weeks. Instances where Vivian had humiliated staff, coerced them into compliance, and most devastatingly, her repeated attempts to dominate Eleanor psychologically and physically. The staff members who had once been silent now stepped forward, corroborating the evidence, describing with clarity the patterns of intimidation and control that had pervaded the household. Vivian's carefully constructed persona began to collapse, piece by piece, in front of the very people she had believed she controlled. "Do you see?" Nathaniel said, his voice steady, carrying to every corner of the hall. "This isn't a single mistake, an isolated incident, or a misunderstanding. This is a pattern, one of manipulation, control, and cruelty. Eleanor endured it quietly for months. Others suffered. And now, finally, the truth is clear." Eleanor rose slowly, moving to the center of the room. "I am not afraid anymore," she said, voice steady, though layered with emotion. "I have lived in silence long enough. No more." The words, simple yet powerful, reverberated through the hall, and the weight of years of abuse seemed to lift from her shoulders. Vivian's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her eyes widened, panic overtaking elegance, and for the first time she lacked the words, the poise, or the power to respond. Her wealth, her charm, her manipulation, all the tools she had wielded so effectively, were now meaningless against the combined force of truth, strategy, and moral authority. Nathaniel advanced calmly, deliberately, ensuring his presence underscored the shift in power. Every movement of his was calculated, a display of control, a silent declaration that the era of fear and intimidation was over. The climax reached its peak when Nathaniel presented the final piece of evidence, documents showing Vivian's attempts to access and manipulate key financial assets, including funds she had attempted to divert from the family company. The irrefutable proof left Vivian with no room to maneuver. Her hands trembled as she tried to collect herself, but the weight of consequence pressed down, heavy and undeniable. Staff members and advisors, who had once feared retaliation, now observed her with a mix of relief and astonishment. The empire she thought she commanded was slipping through her fingers. In a final act of quiet authority, Nathaniel spoke directly to Vivian. The control you believed you had over this family, over this household, over Eleanor and me, it is gone. You will no longer dictate the lives of those who have built this legacy. Eleanor, standing tall beside him, reached for Nathaniel's hand, her eyes shining with tears of liberation and pride. Vivian, overwhelmed by the collective power of truth, finally faltered, collapsing into a chair as the weight of her actions became undeniable. What followed was a legal and personal reckoning. Vivian was barred from the household and from key positions within the family company. Employees who had suffered quietly found their voices, sharing testimony that supported Eleanor's position and ensured Vivian could not regain influence. Nathaniel oversaw every step of the transition, ensuring that justice was comprehensive, deliberate, and permanent. Eleanor, once a symbol of quiet endurance, emerged as a moral authority respected by staff, family, and the broader community. For Nathaniel, the resolution was both professional and profoundly personal. He had regained control over the empire, yes, but more importantly, he had restored dignity, safety, and respect to the woman who had raised him, who had endured abuse silently for decades. The mansion, which had once echoed with fear, now resonated with relief, liberation, and hope. Every corridor, every room, reflected the truth that manipulation and cruelty, no matter how elegantly disguised, could not survive sustained courage, strategic planning, and moral clarity. In the days that followed, the family began to heal. Eleanor, once timid and overshadowed, took a more active role in family decisions, mentoring younger relatives, overseeing charitable initiatives, and asserting her rightful place in the household. Nathaniel, while maintaining his business empire, dedicated time to ensuring the legacy of integrity his mother had built remained untarnished. And Vivian, confronted with the consequences of her actions, was forced to reckon with the limits of wealth and charm when faced with courage and truth. The final scene unfolded in the grand foyer, the same space where the nightmare had begun weeks before. Nathaniel and Eleanor stood together, sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminating the marble floors. The house was quiet, serene, yet alive with renewed energy. Nathaniel placed a hand gently on his mother's shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. Eleanor smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "Yes," she replied, "it's finally over." The billionaire's empire had survived the storm, but more importantly, the family had survived. Justice had been served, not through vengeance or cruelty, but through courage, strategy, and unwavering moral authority. Vivian had learned too late that control has limits, that manipulation cannot endure against truth, and that even the most carefully constructed illusions will crumble under the weight of exposure. In that moment, Nathaniel and Eleanor understood a profound truth. Power is not in wealth, influence, or fear. It is in integrity and courage, and in standing for what is right when the world expects you to remain silent. The mansion, once a symbol of fear and domination, now reflected strength, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between mother and son. And as they looked out over the gardens, bright and alive under the morning sun, they knew the nightmare was gone, and the legacy of the Cross family would continue stronger, wiser, and just.